it might increase because we recruit, or because of attrition and other factors. So by October, we should be able to know how much money we are looking at the budget for 2025, 2026. Remember, as we're having this conversation, we are already now implementing the budget for 2024, 2025, of which the finance bill has been withdrawn. So the implementation of the budget is happening. And so the supplementary budget that we're just about to discuss is at the implementation. Another key document that will follow the budget review and outlook paper is the budget policy statement. And here we are having a national level conversation, because as we are discussing these national level conversation documents, budget documents, similar conversation is happening at the counties. Please do not forget that. So the PFM Act requires that by February 15, the National Treasury has to submit to Parliament the budget policy statement. And also it requires with or without amendments. With or without amendments. This is where now the provisional ceilings we were looking at, here they are firmed up. Now we are saying, for example, the provisional ceilings last year in the budget review and outlook paper were proposing approximately 150 billion for the Ministry of Health. But now the budget policy statement in February came and firmed up and said our provision, what we are providing for the Ministry of Health, is approximately 142 billion. Take that, an example. So this is firmed up, and the budget policy. Parliament sends the policy document back to Treasury with amendments, approved with or without amendments. But most of the time, Parliament always tinkers with this document. In fact, what we have seen most of the time as a practice is that if National Treasury sends a budget policy statement with 100 billion, there is a high likelihood that Parliament will approve that document with 105 billion. So the fiscal deficit that of political dealings that have affected our fiscal space. So the budget policy statement here is locking ceilings we saw in the budget in the provisional ceilings at the budget review and outlook paper, meaning the policy decision has been made that now the Cabinet Secretary for Health, your allocation for the financial year 2025-2026 has been locked, and you cannot go beyond this amount of money. So that is the responsibility of Parliament. And this conversation has to happen by February 28 of every year to allow the preparation of the budget estimates. Now, after February 28, the month of March and April, the national government is preparing the budget estimates that have to be submitted to Parliament by April 30th of every year without fail. It's a statutory requirement. And so at this point, budget and sector distribution cannot be changed, but resources can be moved around programs. Now, take the case of Ministry of Health. We have allocated Ministry of Health 100 billion shillings, for example. And then there is a department, there is a program called curative, there is a program called preventive. The Ministry of Health cannot change the 100 billion, but it can choose to allocate 50 billion to curative and 50 billion to preventive, 40 billion to curative, 60 billion to preventive. That is allowed. April 30th, when the national government has to submit to Parliament the budget estimates. And these budget estimates must be accompanied by a memoranda bill. It used to be that budget estimates will be submitted and then the finance bill will come after appropriation has been approved, until the High Court ruled that the appropriation bill must be accompanied by the finance bill. So both these documents are submitted, but of course, quite a number of times we see this delayed. Of course, to a greater extent, we don't know what happens, and the budget and the finance bill comes quite late. So the month of May and June is when public participation is happening by Parliament. Remember, in the process that we've been learning, the executive, majorly driven by the National Treasury, is preparing these estimates and the policy statement documents and engaging the public. However, this, as researchers for the conduct in Kenya and its land across 120 countries, we found that participation, there are more opportunities being provided. However, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done to avoid public participation being tokenistic, where you submit your feedback to government and then they do not consider your feedback, neither do they give you feedback on what your input, on what you were suggesting. Because the best practice is when you make a submission on the finance bill, for example, they're supposed to give you feedback and tell you, we did not take your feedback for reason A, B, C, D. So between 1st of May and 30th of June, this is when Parliament is discussing the budget estimates and the finance bill and preparing the appropriation bill and undertaking public legislative have gone through, it's and approved, it moves to the president for assent. Now, in between this process, we have budget implementation reports that are produced by the National Treasury and also produced by the Controller of Budget. Now, those documents are extremely very important because they are produced 45 days after every quarter. So, for example, by the time we are done with the end of the financial year, by August 15 or thereabout, we should have the budget implementation report for the fourth quarter. Those quarterly implementation reports are extremely very important because they allow citizens and stakeholders to engage through that process. Key documents to observe would also include the audit report. The audit report, which is required constitutionally, the Auditor General is required to produce and publish an audit report on the previous financial year within 6 months of the close of the financial year. However, the Auditor General, to a greater extent, has majorly been challenged because of resource allocation, and which we have written extensively on why there is need to strengthen oversight institutions so that they are able to produce those reports in a timely manner. And then, Erick, allow me to get to that point, and then we can pick up progressively in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you. I think you've given us a very good rundown of what happens. And this is all the way from August 30th, when the budget process begins, all the way to the 30th of June. And even after that, I mean, telling us that even beyond that, we still have to get some reports to chew on and see whether the budget was actually implemented. It's a good set, of many people, and I'm sure I speak for many people, do not really get to see this process as it's going on until we get to the point of public participation, particularly on taxation measures, the revenue raising measures. And that's where now we start seeing all stakeholders coming in to raise issues. Now, I want to ask you a question before I bring in Julian into this conversation, James. And the question is, throughout this process, especially when talking about the budget policy statement, is taken to Parliament by the 15th, and it must be considered, and Parliament has got to make a decision on it by the end of February. This is where the government is setting to say, this is like how much we'd like to spend per sector. And then as the estimates are brought in, the figures are being moved around. At this point, at the national level in the Ministry of Health, and health is a devolved function, and questioning that, and then can Parliament make a change on that, James?
Grateful for the constitution that we bequeathed to ourselves as a country, because the component of Public Finance Management Act. In actually, if you look at it, for every document that the National Treasury submits do with the information provided by public is another story altogether. Curative program is provided say, why are we allocating $100 billion to a devolved function, right? Or why, for example, do we have why is capitation and Parliament has the mandate to change, of course, to a greater extent, and as we have seen, and evidence is available. The weakest link in our public finance management system has been Parliament and lack of proper funding for oversight institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. People, thank you very much for joining us. Those who've joined us after we started the conversation, we are unpacking the proposed budget cuts for the 2024-2025 financial year. A supplementary budget has been taken to Parliament, and this is relooking at the budget that was passed by Parliament and assented to by the President. It's called the Appropriations Act of 2024. That one, remember, was a budget that had been taken and approved with the figures that have been contained in including those that have been proposed in the finance bill, which was seeking to raise some 340 odd billion shillings. With the removal or expunging of that finance bill in totality, it means that there was a financing gap. Remember, when the president addressed the nation, they are going to put in some money and look for that money by borrowing. Now, the conversation that we're having tonight is, what are these areas that the National Treasury has told Parliament we'd like to cut budgets on? Are these areas going to have an impact on service delivery to the ordinary Mwananchi, or are they not? Our co-host this evening is Julian Zamboko, who is a business journalist with Nation Media Group, and James Moragori, who's the CEO of Institute of public finance, a public finance specialist. Julian, you come in now. We're still, sort of laying the ground here. And we are at Parliament. The budget policy statement has gone in, and then the estimates are brought, to Parliament at where the money is going. And James has just concluded his final remarks here by saying the weakest link in this has so far proven to be Parliament. From your coverage of this budget making process and where you break it down so well on your X and other platforms, Julian's, do you see what James is saying? Is it that members of parliament do not engage with the document well enough? Is it that the citizens do not give the members of parliament adequate feedback for them to then use it to amend the documents as needed? What's that link and what's that missing link, Julians?
Right, thanks, Eric. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who has joined this conversation tonight. We are delving into a very important conversation, given the space in which this country is. I think we're in a good space as a country, and we shouldn't waste the opportunity which has been presented. Parliament, a number of factors come into play. My question to them always is, why are you here defending the proposals? Because remember, the proposals come from the executive. And we are the citizens giving our feedback. And as a legislature, you sit right at the center and you're supposed to listen to both sides and look within the context of the spending obligations for the country. And when you talk about the spending obligations, it's important to clarify. There is expenditure on which you have no discretion. And that's what principally falls under the...
It's financial jargon. Now, if you're not Julian Zamboko, or if you're not James Muragori, or people in that space, you'll be sitting there and just hearing words and figures, and you'll be lost. And why we said let's have this conversation tonight or I've seen people asking, why are we adding pesa ya mafuta? When is pesa ya mafuta going to come down? And just trying to show, so how is that conversation actually contained in this very technical document that is before Parliament now? I want to read a couple of comments of people who are in this conversation as we go on, and you can just see the comments as well. And thank you very much for everybody who's followed. In Karaoke Njiro says you can actually follow. One of the easy ways to explore the national budget is by going to openbudget.or.ke. These guys have done some good job of just breaking it down. Abdurrahman is saying, if we can just reduce the technicalities and the jargon and make it the conversation as easy as possible. I agree with you, Abdurrahman. That's what we are aiming to do tonight. Someone please explain how we can get fuel to 80 bob. That's what Rich Auntie just wants to hear. Okay, so let's now get into the conversation proper. Supplementary budget before Parliament.
implementation progresses across the year. This is constitutionally provided in Kenya. And it's because there could be unforeseen things that happen during budget implementation. Remember, we have started budget for 2024-2025. Now, we have a supplementary budget because the country has had an issue with the finance bill, meaning that we have a shortfall in financing of the budget. So we have to bring down the projected estimates, and that can only be cured by having a budget document that recognizes that we are unable to raise that revenue. Over years, the Kenya government has been known to do not one, not even two, almost three supplementary budgets per year. And we saw that being abused very much in the previous regimes, and which is very unfortunate. Supplementary budgets in Kenya, to a greater extent, has been used to circumvent the process of public participation. And we have also, as the institute, over the years, also questioned why supplementary budgets happen. But it also realizes that there is, because of the requirement for public participation, there is a legal process in developing the budget estimates that are submitted to Parliament by 30th of April every year. As Julian has lightly put it, we have never seen an opportunity for engagement on the supplementary budget. So it is the easiest option to add anything, and because the public will not have an opportunity in that process, and there will be no one questioning. So supplementary budget then becomes a mischievous tool of the executive to include items of funding that would otherwise not be funded in the normal budget process, because people would be able to pick and identify that process. So that is the way I would try to bring it in an easier manner for all of us to come to that to understand.
Okay, Muragori. Now, Julians, you did a very good X-thread the other day once the supplementary budget came out, and you broke down where the main figures were moving from your immediate observation. So just take us through that, Julians. First of all, before you actually do that, so the supplementary budget left the National Treasury, it went to Parliament. Tell us what the Speaker of the National Assembly has communicated to MPs regarding this supplementary budget in terms of timelines and what's expected to happen. And then now you'll give us your breakdown of the supplementary budget.
Thank you, Eric. So the supplementary estimates were made public by the National Treasury sometime over the weekend. And the Speaker of the National Assembly then gave a communique indicating that, one, I have transmitted this matter to the clerk of the National Assembly to begin prioritizing business, because remember, Parliament comes back on the 23rd of July, which is not too far now. And two priority issues we're looking at. One is the memorandum which was sent by the President back to the House with regard to finance bill. And his communique was basically delete all 69 clauses from the bill to get rid of it. Now, the second one, because now the finance bill was transmitted, the supplementary appropriations then have gone to the Budget and Appropriations Committee, and we are expecting that by the time we are coming back, the Budget and Appropriations Committee number or two that came from the National Treasury. So from a procedural standpoint, that's how we're looking like. Looking at the supplementary estimates themselves, I must say, first of all, personally, I felt a little underwhelmed by the supplementary budget, and here's why. All along, the tone that we have received from the highest office in the country has been suggesting that we are in a position where there is no expenditure that is a sacred cow. Every expenditure will go to the chopping board and will be cut side of the budget, whereby we are dealing with the day-to-day day-to-day expenditure, whether it's salaries and allowances, etc. If you look at the executive, out of 156 billion worth of cuts, 122 billion is attributable to development spending. So you begin to question the spirit of the supplementary budget that has been tabled, because the uniqueness of the moment we are in is that we must not just do things for the sake of doing. We must think about our PFM process from a prioritization standpoint. So that is where my first issue came in. We have 156 billion worth of cuts in the executive, 122 is going to development spending, some 30 or so billion is now going to recurrent spending. And that tells you that clearly we have gone for the traditional low-hanging fruit, because in every other supplementary budget, anytime there's a need for cuts, what is being cut? The development spending, which is not good for this economy. The second thing is the window that has been created for public participation. Now, this is just my view. Unlike the finance bill, which is purely text, and we can all read and make reference to the Parent Act and see what is being changed, the appropriations bill is a fairly technical engagement. One, you need to be good with your numbers. Two, you need to have some very good historical tracking of how expenditure has evolved over time, so that even where sometimes it happens, there's a mistake in the document, then you can easily point it out and see this is how this number should be looking like, and not what we are seeing in the document itself. So to give us about a week, because the comments should be first of all, we generally struggle to submit comments on this kind of documents, and secondly, it just needs a lot of intensity when it comes to dedication on the appropriations bill. So what are we seeing in terms of the numbers? The JSS, that is the junior and of course, this has been a subject of intense debate in this country. All the development spending, from my analysis, all development spending that had been assigned to the Executive Office of the President, the Deputy President, the Prime Cabinet Secretary, and State House has been shelved. Of course, the question there comes in when you talk about renovating State House, for instance. Should we really be calling that development spending? Or should it be categorized as something else? We have seen deep cuts when it comes to the State Department for Energy. And remember, this deals with the last mile connectivity. Another key question there being asked is when you talk about access to electricity being a basic need, typically, should we be? That is something which the Treasury had already hinted in its June 14th Gazette advisory to the Clerk of the National Assembly. We have seen it coming up again. If you decide to look at the development side of the numbers, I'm just trying to give some very quick highlights here. You will see the deepest cuts there coming in from the State Department of Roads, which is down about 14 billion. And that just tells you that from a spending plan perspective, in terms of priorities, in FY 24-25, that is the financial year which began July this year, we should be seeing a lot less in terms of roads projects than we have in the past. State Department of Energy, I've already highlighted 18 billion there going to the last mile connectivity, another big issue. We have seen cuts when it comes to medical services. And specifically, if you look at the line item, there is the one for medical interns. This guy is on the streets not too far back. Already we're talking about budget cuts here. What does that mean from a service delivery standpoint? So Eric, there's a lot there to unpack there, but by and large, as I began by saying, I felt a bit under the leaning in terms of the cuts is heavily on the recurrent, is heavily on the development side and not on the recurrent. I'd like to leave it at that, Eric.
Well, thank you, Julians. So just to recap what I've heard you say, Julians, is number one, there's 156 billion shillings proposed budget cuts from what was taken to Parliament. And before I just continue, what was the actual budget figure in the Appropriations Act? As we stand right now, what's the budget for this year?
Thanks, Eric. So first of all, let me just clarify something here. The cuts, the president, the shelving of Finance Bill 24, Treasury had decided, or rather the government had decided, that it would slash expenditure by 177 billion shillings, and then it would increase borrowing by 169.7 billion shillings. So that's where we start. What have we seen in the supplementary budget? At the executive level alone, we're talking about 156 billion worth of cuts. Now, when you look at the aggregate budget, the total budget, the slash there is actually a lot smaller at about 122 billion shillings. And that's because there are line items which are being increased as others are being decreased. For example, if you look at the allocation for counties' equitable share, initially it was at 400.1 billion shillings. We're now looking at 410 billion shillings. If you go to the consolidated fund services, the allocation for pensions is going up. So net, the deduction is 122.1, I think, billion. 7 billion worth of cuts, aggregate from the president. Now we are at 122, because remember the 156 is only at the executive level. And definitely, because that shortfall has to be plugged in from somewhere. So we're expecting to see some adjustment in terms of the borrowing plan for the current financial year. On to the question of the budget size. So Treasury, when we were dealing a lot earlier with the estimates, we were looking at something around 4.2, 4.3 trillion shillings. And then the president came and said, look, we've had a conversation and we have decided to slash this by about 300 billion shillings. That is how we ended up with the conversation around 3.9 trillion shillings. Now, the final numbers I saw from the Budget and Appropriations Committee, and that is what is contained in the appropriations, was 4.065 on my count. It could be different depending on who you're talking to. 4.065 is what I had. Currently, if you look at the deductions that we are talking about now, my numbers come to slightly above 3.9 trillion shillings. The number I actually got was 3.91. I have seen Treasury's number is 3.87 trillion shillings. So there could be some reconciliation to do there, but I always believe in combing through these numbers line by line to be sure that what Treasury is giving me is what I finally have. So those are the numbers I'm looking at, Eric.
Thank you, Julians. All right, so we're going to open up the conversation so that we can hear from other stakeholders, everybody who's joined in. Thank you for coming. We are unpacking the budget cuts as passed. We know what we've done. Citizens have said we do not want to cough an extra cent in taxes for revenue for the next financial year. What did that mean? We do not want to spend an extra 400 and 340 whatever billion shillings that was proposed in to be raised through the finance bill. So the budget has got to be reduced to now fit. We have got to cut our suit according to our new size of the cloth. What is that size of the cloth? And the cuts, as Julian has just taken us through, top figures, for example, where he just looking at it, and we're going to hear from James Boragori as well. Just looking at it, we are hearing the energy sector, the last mile connectivity, and this is ensuring that there is electricity connection to as many households in the country as possible, has been soon after the president had hosted a extending connectivity to the country. So 18 billion shillings is not going to be available anymore for this. It means that what they had planned for, 18 billion shillings, has just gone away. Roads, 14 billion shillings cut on that. Former Roads and Transport CS Kipchumba Murkomen, I had a conversation with him last week on Spice, and he was talking about, for example, the kind of money that they received in the just concluded financial year, which was 26 billion shillings for roads. And he was saying the roads that are ongoing right now, the ones that are not completed, if you just look at from Machakos Junction all the way to Rironi, for example, those in Nairobi, there's a construction of a road that started Machakos Junction to Kitengela Junction. It was launched by President Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto when they were going to launch their re-election campaign in 2017, and they were going to Machakos. That road not completed. There's a section from ABC Place going all the way to the Mahio Junction at Rironi. That road, many people, children were born, they have started going to school. They believe that that's how a road should look like, where you time and cross 4 lanes and hope that you're not hit by a vehicle, and then you get to the middle of the road and then hope again as you cross the other side that you're not hit by a vehicle. Many accidents have happened there, and this is a story that's across the country. So many roads that are still not completed. The ministry does not have budget. There's a further budget cut of 14 billion shillings. Interns were on strike the other day. Actually, doctors were on strike because people who did their KCSE exam 7 years ago or 8 years ago, the news being hoisted shoulder high by parents and teachers and fellow students because they've scored A's, and they were interviewed by TV journalists, and they said, "Yeah, I want to be a cardiologist." Spent 6 years there. They graduated as doctors, and so now they are Dr. So and so. But the law requires that they must serve 1 year internship under the supervision of a doctor, a registered doctor, before they can be registered as doctors and allowed to practice. So they are not doctors. They cannot practice. They are trained doctors. They are graduate doctors, but they cannot practice as doctors until they do that 1 year internship. 2 years, some of them haven't gone yet. More are graduating this year. They will not go or may not go. The budget for the Ministry of Health for medical interns is a cut for it. So as we're talking about now cutting back and cutting our suit according to the size of our cloth, this is what it means. And also, we are seeing the reduction, of course, in the other offices that the president announced. No more office of first lady, no more office of the spouse of the deputy president or spouse of the prime cabinet secretary, or renovations in state house are going to be cut by half, and so on and so forth. This is the impact, and that's why we're having this conversation. So we can all discuss and say, are we happy with the proposals? Or what would we tell the Budget and Appropriations Committee of the National Assembly, led by Ndindi Nyoro, that's right now supposed to be getting our feedback and take it to Parliament? So, James Moragori, what have you noticed as the budget cuts? And then after you give us your feedback, we want to see people who'd like to ask questions or put a comment on this. Please raise your hand, and we're going to give you the mic. James?
Thank you. Thank you, Erick. So from where we are and working, among was for citizens and not for government. And I think this is where now we would expect Parliament, which now it's the faith in Parliament has went down, and we hope over time it will come back. We still survive to question, because like Julian said, Parliament should not be defending the executive. The executive, when National Treasury submits its estimates to Parliament, National Treasury has done its part. And no one from the National Treasury sits in parliamentary committees. So sometimes when we see our members of Parliament defending executive propositions, it is very disappointing. How, of course, we expect that to happen because the executive, the ruling party, coalition has a majority in Parliament. So one of the things in these estimates that we note is that while there were commitments to strongly align on parastatal reforms, the supplementary estimate has not spoken to that. And we should be keen to note that most of the resources that are going to state departments, the president, for example, the president committed and said there were 47 of them that were needed to be looked at. However, we know it's only Parliament that functions taken over by the apparent ministry, or those functions devolved where they are. So we see lack of that commitment. However, of course, in this in this supplementary budget, and again, we're saying the commitment, we would wish to see Parliament interrogate this further, to be able to question some of the decisions and cut. For example, you notice that there is a lot of enterprise and financial inclusion resources. And when we reviewed that all this, we found there were approximately 9.7 billion Department of Micro Small Enterprise, State Department for Youth Affairs, State Department for Gender, quite a number of funds amounting to around 9.7 billion. Now, these resources, well, it is important for government to provide these resources. I think the government should also get at a point where its responsibility is to create a decent business environment. Yeah, of course, we've seen the Auditor General raise questions around the Financial Inclusion Fund, and so that should be also have been coming from that. We don't feel the strong commitment, strong desire, because they're finding 122 billion has been cut from development expenditure, and approximately 34 billion is what was cut from the recurrent expenditure. Recurrent is it's that Mandazi budget, and a lot of tea, yeah. And of course, there's a lot of allowances, for civil service. We pay people for the work, and for example, there was a wage conference or salaries conference convened by Salaries and Remuneration Commission that should have formed a very strong base of the supplementary budget. And for example, in this supplementary budget, the SRC, which to a greater extent has also disappointed citizens, doing. The other question is, of course, we've seen a program. Now, should we be talking about increasing the CDF kit while we are struggling in raising resources? These are some of the questions that we are saying, that probably potentially we have wished to see the executive and led strongly by the presidency. Question, of course, it's so as we consider that we are in an austerity function. Thank you, Erick.
Erick, can I just chime in there? The PFM Act is very clear in this country that ideally our wage bill to revenue should be at a ceiling of 35. We are in the mid-40s. We are actually at about 45 or 46%. I mean, granted, I know we have come down over time significantly, but shouldn't that be the first starting point of this supplementary budget? That we have a very serious look at the public sector wage bill, including allowances, because that's really the elephant in the room in this conversation, and see how to rationalize that expenditure, because as we said, we're in a moment where there are no sacred cows. Any expenditure item should be able to go to the chopping board and be looked at and slashed. Think about this, Erick. If you look at the National Assembly supplementary allocation, the budget for domestic travel and subsistence for the National Assembly their budget for something like hospitality, it's now about just 274 million Kenya shillings, a tidy sum. So there are areas where
I want to talk, pick some of the comments and questions that are coming in. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will assign you the mic to go here. Arega says, if the intention of this supplementary budget is to address issues we've already raised on cutting on spending by slashing out unnecessary expenditure and wastage, why would public participation at this point be celebrated? Isn't it laughable that it took Gen Z to force the government to rethink its fiscal policy and live within their means? I don't find that this should be lauded as a golden opportunity. It involves the people. We needed not to be here in the first place. Coming to the comment on that, changes. Nduka says, if so, the government uses the supplementary budget as a backdoor to allocate things that they would not usually allocate through the normal budget. After voting for supplementary budget, does it take effect immediately? That's a question that Muragori, you can answer quickly as we go on. Just a question: are payments on ongoing projects under recurrent expense? A column in the county's development expenditure reports. Karaoke had told us where to find the budget. And Daniel says, I think the conversation on unpacking the budget is good, but the undiscussed conversations is how we're able to one, increase our revenue collections with our debt situation. I think we're going to host a debt conversation in coming days just to look at our debt issue. So I just want to come straight to you, James, and you can answer a couple of that question, and then we pick up some more. One, when the Budget and Appropriations Committee presents its report to Parliament next week, what happens next? And how does the voting happen? And then what happens to that? Does it go back to the president and he gets his signs and that becomes our new budget? What's that process?
Thanks. So you have the way the appropriation bill is presented, and also the supplementary budget. There is no correlation because the estimates themselves are in the plug the State Department of Medical Services, and under it has those programs and the allocations. Then you'll go, and then there is the annexes, and the program-based budget for this means that it allows us to see if the Ministry of Health says we are going to vaccinate with the money you gave us, and the reason why we use the same amount of money was for reason ABCD. So now, here you have the supplementary budget that has come to Parliament. It's of course factored in program-based budget. Is now a scaled version of that. With only the programs, with no indicators themselves of the amount of money being allocated per program. But also it even gets and then you miss you are not able to relate on how actually the resources were spent. So next week, when Parliament Committee, led by Dede Nyoro, have submitted their feedback, to the House, the supplementary budget will still follows the same process of registration through the committee and submission of reports in the House, and ultimately, when it's been fully voted for, it will go to the president for assent, for it to become law. However, we need to understand that our law allows government to spend if there is no appropriation bill approved by Parliament. The government is not stopping. There is nothing, if by the end of July we have not approved the budget, the supplementary budget, it does not mean that our civil servants will not be paid. The government is allowed to spend up to a maximum of 50% of the previous budget. By all means, presents us a very good opportunity now to engage strongly and team, Dede Nyoro as the budget chair of the budget committee, and also remembering that we have a parliamentary budget office, which is an institution different story. But what we know as the Institute of Public Finance and our interaction with Parliamentary Budget Office is that the team that's at Parliamentary Budget Office is a highly skilled team. And we have seen their reports that are publicly engagement in the supplementary budget, engaged on the finance bill and put Kimani Kuria to task, and many stakeholders did. It is still another opportunity to engage and question, for example, why are we still funding devolved functions in this budget? There is more than, to a greater extent, there is more than 100 billion in devolved functions. Probably this was a constitutional oversight. Senate should be able, even Senate, to make its submission to the National Assembly and question why is it that the national government is still funding devolved functions at the national level? Why do we have National Irrigation Board in Nairobi undertaking irrigation in Mwea, for example, when the county government of Kirinyaga can go to do that work as a conditional grant, all with support, so that National Irrigation Board is left to oversee the policy. Political risk on this one, and say, for those regional development authorities, there is no allocation as we transfer the mandate. There should not be any funding for development, cut off. There should be any new development happening for any function that is devolved and still at the national level. We should be able to see Senate needs to wake up and safeguard the interests of the counties by demanding that none of the county functions being held at the national level should be funded. Thank you.
Open up the floor now. I've seen there's a lady called Miss Madai who's joined the conversation. Miss Madai is very, very big on matters of championing public participation on the budget making process. Miss Madai, I've sent you an invitation to be a speaker, and you can accept that invitation and come in and speak. Let's hear from Tim. Tim Kiprono, you've requested to speak, PFM and open governance enthusiast. Tim, please go ahead.
Hello guys, Eric, thanks for hosting this very interesting conversation, and the two gentlemen, to take us through, the budget process, but also the supplementary budget. Now, Julian have really raised a very, very important issues as on that, to just, are we also then, financing this function at the county level? Because I mean, there's very high chance of duplication. But I also think then, in terms of just making sure like our fiscal space, is kind of like, I mean, it's not constrained as it is right now, dealing with debt and a couple of other things, competing priorities. Should we then start, the conversation of auditing and costing, the functions afresh, so that we know which functions belong to who, and then those functions then follow resources. And then a question for James. So James, you mentioned, that Kenya, in terms of, looking at the credibility of the budget, because I mean, given that the budget becomes a binding document through the approval process at National Assembly, are too many supplementary budgets an indication that we have weak capacity to forecast? Because if we are doing a supplementary budget because probably we think we are not going to raise the revenue that we anticipated at the beginning, is that a sign that we have weak capacity, or even combination of political reasons, because could it be that we are overestimating or even need to meet Eric is, so we've talked about funding new projects, but also then completing ongoing projects. And I know you mentioned a couple of roads, and I'm just going back to, so we passed some regulations a while, like 2 years ago, the public investment regulations. And I also read a couple of articles, talks about the number of projects that are stalling or incomplete, including 700 on CDF alone. Then I'm asking myself that, we're struggling with it means our money, part of our money is lying somewhere and requires additional resources to finance that. Now, in terms of making choices for our investment, is it time for us to start thinking how we choose what to invest and where to invest, so that then even before investing in a new road, then first of all, we have to complete whatever it was, it's not complete, so that we start thinking about our projects in terms of phased projects. So if our project is 2 phases, 3 phases, then we have to think about the next phase now, even like we're financing new projects for next year. So we say we have commitments for next year for projects that are not complete. So let's not fund new projects. So that then, James and Julian and the rest of us who are able to analyze budget, then analyze also then budgets from that perspective. Like, why are we, investing in a new project while there are a couple of projects that then needs to be financed? But also then looking at how do we decide on these investments and how do they impact the economy? I come from Marakwet. There's a road. There are 2 roads that go to my place from, they diverge from same place. So one is tarmac, and no one uses that road. Then I'm asking myself, the road that example, how do we decide on our investments in a way that whatever we invest as scarce resources that we have, then it's able to impact on the economy and be able, then the economy is able to generate the revenues that we want, to pay the debts and to, to finance our economic activities and so forth. I think I will leave it.
Thank you so much, Eric, and the rest of the panelists for holding this discussion. I'd like to start by saying that we should be very conscious of the fact that resources are scarce. So the government cannot be able to do or implement all projects in one financial year. So you'll find that most of the time they will spread this budget execution across several financial years. Also, it is important for us to prioritize well, and that's and at the same time adequately financing critical sectors that are human rights centered. So we want to avoid budget cuts, significant budget cuts on human rights centered sectors such as education and health. We should also note that the budget is a powerful tool that ought to provide for equity in the distribution of resources and cushion special interest groups, which are stipulated in the Constitution of Kenya. That includes youth, women, the elderly, and persons with disability. They say that when the winds of change blow, some build walls while others build windmills. So although the government thought they reject the finance bill was a setback, in my opinion, it was a win for the citizens, as it has given us a chance to trim priorities. The National Assembly has put out a call for public participation, but the bone of contention, as my colleagues in the PFM space here can attest to, is whether the public input will be accommodated or not. And most of the times it rarely is. So we end up going for public participation forums, giving our input, but when you look at the final approved document, the input is missing. So we need to be aware of that and ensure that this time round they are going to accommodate our input. So I want to touch a little bit on the education and health sectors. Julian had mentioned a bit about the allocation and the budget cut, and to put that into perspective, it's about 6.7 billion. For secondary education, there was a $4.7 billion. When it comes to the health sector, the State Department for Medical Services has been revised downwards by 7.1%, which is equivalent to 7 billion. And you should note that this particular department hosts the reproductive, maternal, newborn, and child adolescent health sector, which is also called RAMCA. So been advocating for additional resources, hence the relentless strikes that we have been seeing in the country. So further budget cuts suggest that critical health services will become more strained. Then budget allocation does not guarantee that there is going to be disbursement, because we have seen a lot of delayed disbursement from the national government to counties and also to ministries, departments, and agencies. So in the past financial years, counties and ministries, departments, and agencies as well have faced issues of late disbursement of funds from Treasury. And additionally, these MDAs and the county governments have demonstrated an inability to exhaust their budget. So we have on one hand that the Treasury does not avail these resources on time. And when the resources are availed, these ministries, departments, and agencies or the county governments are unable to execute their budget. So as citizens, I think it's up to us to be abreast on how counties are implementing their budgets. As Julian had said before, we rarely participate during the implementation stage. So when I was looking through the supplementary budget, I noted some agencies and these are usually utilized. One of them was the Witness Protection Agency. It raises questions about its effectiveness and transparency, especially given the sensitive nature of its operations. So we should reevaluate some of these allocations to see where we can reroute this budget allocation to go into the human-centered sectors such as education and health. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Eve, for this. We also have one of the listeners in the conversation who are now designated as a speaker, former Cabinet Secretary Moses Kuria, who's a former Member of Parliament and a former member of the Budget and Appropriations Committee who has participated in the budget making process in Parliament. Moses, thank you for joining us. Come in. I'd like, first of all, to get clarity. You want to speak to us as a former minister, as a former MP, or as a voter and a taxpayer? Moses.
Because the facts are just the facts. But let me say that I rarely join spaces, but I to have this conversation on a wider audience, because this is really the crux of the matter. So I have followed the discussion, and I just want to say some few things. One, you asked a question: does the public we have a chance in the sector working groups? Remember, the budget policy statement is a product of sector working groups, and the sector working groups is really the beginning point of the budget process. But there's still other things which I think the gentleman from the Institute of Public Finance can tell you. There's still other opportunities that exist before then. For example, there exists a checkpoint where public can interrogate the previous budget spending. And I think that is important, because what happens is that in this country, we come from one budget cycle, we finish, we go to another, and there is no audit of the previous one. Somewhere within the budget cycle, I can't remember exactly where, but I think James or the expert can be able to look at that. There exists an opportunity for people to say, how did we spend the money that was available the previous year? How was that appropriated? So I think that's the first one. But I think the most critical one, and I think that one of historical perspective is very important, because it ought to inform subsequent budget making. But nonetheless, before we develop the budget policy statement, these sector working groups, they normally start somewhere in KICC. I know of a lady called Mora. She must be in her 60s or something, or thereabout. She's the only person who goes to all these sector hearings. And the kind of conversation now that we have, if we could have the same level of conversation within the sector working groups, there's a lot. And I'm not saying that there's a guarantee that if people raise their voice within the sector, but I'm told by my Ruya friends that there's a Ruya saying that someone who beats a stone says, even if the stone does not answer, on the very minimum, the stone has heard. So I think it's important to look at this process of the interventions that the public can make way before the 15th of February deadline for submission of estimates and submission of the finance bill to Parliament. And I remember when I was a member of the budget committee, we engineered about, I can't remember, 2017, where we said before the budget, before what was happening is that we passed the estimates, and then after passing the estimate, then we look at the finance bill. Of course, we have said we were going to spend 3 trillion or 4 trillion. Then that is passed. Then now we go back to the finance bill and say we can't release that particular money. That's when, in the wisdom of Parliament, we brought a convergence between the submission of the finance bill and the estimates into Parliament on the 30th of April. So that was aligned, and so therefore now we are able to look at revenue and expenditure at the same time. So the correct answer is yes, there exists an opportunity. 2, it has not been utilized by Kenyans at all. I'm not saying that even if they turned up, it could have made any impact, but it is important, just to be on the right side of history, that many Kenyans do participate in that process. Probably with wisdom of hindsight and from what has happened is that probably as a country we need to be much more to move with the times, and this public participation should look at more modern ways of participation to enable, even it could be even cheaper, to if you can bring this thing to to the public scrutiny, maybe through digital, through social media, through that. Probably something that from what has happened, that I think should be able to be looked at. I will revisit that soon. Let me move to the analysis of the supplementary budget as has been presented, and just to mention, as some of you are making the contributions, and let me take the issue of transfer to county government. And I think James or someone has correctly said that we moved from 401 billion to 410. And for me, that was striking odd, because when we announced austerity measures, we did agree that everybody has to take a haircut, including county government. So to take a haircut on the budget. And the reality is, I don't know. I've had the figures of 120 in terms of the net, down from 170. I really want to shed some light on that. The saving has now dropped to 120, but that's only happened. The 170 and the 350 was only part of the story. There's a bigger part of the story. In financial year 2023-2024, we have something we call crossover. And this is one thing that, again, because we don't give a lot of attention to scrutiny of this budget process, that is one item that gets lost all the time. Crossover means, and I think the lady who has contributed last has spoken about something very important, that not everything that gets budgeted gets the money, gets the exchequer. I think that's a very important point. And let me start from that to this contribution. In the year 2023-2024, the crossover amount, meaning how much did we cross over with from the other year, that we said this was our budget, but we didn't have the money to fund. In 22-23, the previous budget, we crossed over with 77 billion of unmet expectations from budgeted items. We've budgeted all right, but budget is not equal to money. So we closed over with 77. And then what we do is that when we open the new budget, we call it the first charge. So we tell MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies, before you even you look at the money you budgeted for a current year, please look at the people, so to avoid build up of the pending bills. So we closed over with 77 billion on our first year of administration, which for me was warning. And I did raise that in several forums. But this year, in 23-24, we have crossed over with 250 billion shillings. That's staggering. That means that is the first charge. That means that's the first thing you appropriate, because you promised me I budget for this road or for that water or for something, and you didn't give me the money, and now the year has passed. So this crossover has got two options. Either it is dropped. We say that after all, maybe there's no likelihood that that money is going to be spent, or two, it is revoted. So what this supplementary budget has done is actually a two-in-one. It's a budget, it's a supplementary budget to cut in line with the austerity. It's also a supplementary budget to revote some items of the crossover, which said surely you cannot punish people who had already prepared to spend simply because you didn't give them the money. As to how much of the 250 billion gets revoted in this, I don't know. I need to, to do a tooth comb on the supplementary budget. But just to give you an example, the last month of the financial year, Treasury did not send money to counties. So there is an element of the money of the last month that was not sent to counties that has now been reverted into this year, because counties are saying we had budgeted for this money. So now the figure, the apparent increase from 408 to 410 is, first of all, we moved from 408 down to, I think, by around 20-30 billion thereabout. But then that has been now undone by the money that we didn't collect, or we didn't get enough money that we didn't set the counties there. So we really have a two-in-one, and the experts in here can do some number crunching to see how much of the crossover has been reverted and how much that has sort of seemingly diluted, the austerity as has been announced. Let me finish by giving my perspective on austerity generally, or just the holding of expenditure vis-a-vis. And I've had wonderful contributions from people on JSS, on this, on the development budget. Where are we increasing on? Why are we having more subtle decreases on recurrent expenditure, as opposed to development expenditure, which is more, which is the gradient is sharper on that. And I totally agree. The reason is very simple, and I'll be very, very, very honest here. The way our budget process is fatally wrong, and I think I've talked about this. You can just Google for all my contribution on for my 8 years that I was a member of the budget committee, that I tried to fix this issue. Forget even about my time in government. Our budget process is wrong because I want you to say a prayer for tonight. You need to say some prayers for the accounting officers. Some people call the principal secretaries, who are seemingly supposed to be in charge of budget. Unknown to people, the way our budget process works, even our accounting officers, they encounter the budget sometimes the same time with the public. They make their presentations the same way that people are saying, oh, we went for this public participation, it didn't amount for much. It's the same thing even within government. Because when we talk about mandarins, when we talk about, a very deep interest, this for me is something very, very, very dear to my heart, because the budgets are owned by some characters called CFOs, the chief finance officers. And what will happen is that the CFOs will do the budget, then present to some desk officer somewhere in Treasury. So then Treasury will compile everything. By the time even that budget comes to cabinet, first of all, the timelines are very squeezed. Oh, we have got this constitutional timeline. We have to comply with 15th of February for BPS, and so the whole budget process is made at the at gunpoint. You can say that, and that gunpoint is a gunpoint of timelines. And if it is a problem for the public and for people, people who can be able to interrogate, it's even a bigger problem for people within government itself. And that's something that is, we cannot fix, these issues until we fix that issue. So, 2016, under Mutaba Mutsimi, we had an audit, value audit. Some we call the value audit of the budget under Mutaba Mutsimi. Edward Ouko, then as Auditor General, is the one we contracted. That report is publicly available from parliamentary records, so that you can be able to see the value for money audit of budget, not just from a national government, but especially an audit of devolution and a question of whether devolution is answering to the needs of Kenyans. Now, so what needs to be done is, because as I conclude, the issue is what needs to be done. We need to provide more ample interrogation on the expenditure, and especially of recurrent expenditure. I am now from this conversation reminded of the terms of reference that we gave on that committee that's looking on debt. And by reflection from this space, I think it is important to expand the mandate of that team to also have a look at how we come up with our recurrent expenditure and to give the public a voice on recurrent expenditure. Because as I've been saying consistently again, that's where the animal lies. That's where the problem lies. To go for more modern ways of allowing the public to participate in the budget making process, not just going for some meeting in KICC or whatever spaces like this and digital that need to be brought in space. And three, I have heard of something called Okowa Uchumi something, and I'm assuming that is a combination of several, actors and players within the civil society need to be found, whereby those wonderful ideas are also fed into those people who make policy. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Moses. James.
Thank you very much, Moses. And first of all, it is not lost to us that the current crisis we are in as a country right now was caused by the budget committee that you served in the last two parliaments. That budget committee in parliament was spineless. They bent to the whims of the executive and expanded the fiscal space that was there. And please, while we recognize the very strong contribution, I want to note that because the reports of the budget committee and based on what was submitted by the executive kept expanding and expanding. I also want to bring to your attention, I think you've been in parliament and government for so long since PFM Act 2012 came into place. That find themselves in the sector working group reports that form the budget for the next financial year. In government and donors, those who fund them,